Thank you and good morning. Can you hear me? Is this microphone working? Yeah, okay, back there and everything. I'm going to do a couple of things I didn't do last night. There was a piece I was going to actually conclude with. For those of you who were there last night, I suddenly called an audible and ended because I felt like after the journey we'd been on last night, I needed to end on a note that was maybe a bit more hopeful than this piece. But it's a really important story to me because my intention in writing this book in many ways was to write a thank you card to the teachers who not only helped so many kids from Katrina get back on their feet again, but really helped families get back on their feet again and parents get back on their feet again. The name of the book is Sugarcane Academy. It is about a school that we started, a modest school. It started with about a dozen kids, ended up with about 80 children, with a teacher named Paul Reno, my daughter's beloved first grade teacher, that when we evacuated from New Orleans to the town of Karen Crow in southwest Louisiana, we faced the option of putting our kids, and our neighbors were with us, they were going to put their kids into the public schools. But the idea of losing our last grasp on our splinter of New Orleans at that time was sort of unthinkable. We had evacuated together, had stayed together, and the thought of splitting apart. I was just talking with Christine here. None of us imagined we could cry for a week straight. None of us, and I never knew I could actually stay up for 4 days without sleeping until those 4 days right after Katrina. We had to make a lot of decisions in a hurry. And the decision to put our kids into the local schools, while it was a decision that many New Orleans families did, and they had really good experiences by and large. By and large. We had this teacher from our town who was our kids' teacher, and he had evacuated. So we called him up and said, we have this idea, do you want to start a one-room schoolhouse for kids? And you have to sort of know this guy to know he's a very kind of understated guy. And he said, well, that's the best idea I've heard since the hurricane. So we didn't quite have enough chairs. My daughter shared a chair with another kid that first day. We did have some notebooks and pencils, no books, no textbooks. We just really had a teacher and some kids and a dingy little ex-accountant's office in New Iberia, but it was 2 doors away from the donut shop, so that was really important to the kids. Even more important, it was about a half a mile walk from the Bayou Teche, and that became the location of the playground and the start of adventures. The kids would go down and find a snake skin and go to the library and try to identify what the skin was and who it belonged to, and that was science class. They would learn words like evacuate and hurricane and write them in their journal, and that was spelling, and that was writing. And the intent for this class was what Paul Reno, the teacher, called pure teaching. He had a chance to really do the kind of school that he always wanted to do. I think that was his sort of secret reason for taking this on, even more than to help me and to help the kids and to help the teacher. It all kind of went together in one package for him, the chance to teach the kind of school that he always wanted to teach. But then once my kid was in school, I was a journalist. I was editor of a weekly newspaper in New Orleans. And I wanted to get around and start to try to see other kids and other families and try to understand what had happened through the eyes of kids. And I learned very early on something I already knew. It's like when I'm walking home, my daughter is in 4th grade. If I'm walking home from her and said, what'd you do in school today? It's like, stuff. Oh, yeah, so I sometimes get what they had for lunch out of her. That's sort of the most I can kind of get, in the course of a day. And maybe that they had math or something like that. It's sort of the same if you're going to sit down to a kid and say, what was your experience in Katrina? First of all, you don't want to re-traumatize them, by having this strange guy with a tape recorder ask, what about your grandmother who died or something like that. So it became this very cautious, careful process for me. And I leaned on people who have gone through institutions like this, who learned professionally how to talk with kids, social workers, teachers, counselors. I visited a school in Houston, Texas, where after there were a lot of problems with New Orleans kids showing up in the schools in Houston, there were a lot of fights, a lot of people not getting along, sort of territorial feelings. They started a school for 300 New Orleans kids all in one building. And these were kids who had gone, you all saw the stories, they'd gone through the convention center, they'd gone, walked through water to the Superdome in New Orleans where, tens of thousands of people were and did not get water for 5 days. So these are kids that saw a piece of their home and had an experience that I feel we all need and needed to learn from. So in talking with the counselor there and talking with the teachers there that knew those kids well, I had a chance to meet some of the kids themselves and get their stories. The same thing happened. I had this kind of crazy experience I go into in the story, in the book. There was a series of fallout shelters, evacuation shelters, kind of like fallout shelters really, that extended in a line from New Orleans to Houston and beyond in those first days after Katrina, where from the Superdome they were bused to Baton Rouge, they were bused to Lafayette, bused to Houston, to Austin, and on, where they set up rows and rows and rows and rows of cots, and they had sometimes they had food. Once they got to New Orleans, they had food and water, and that became home for people who lost everything. And I'm from the Midwest originally, so we had a lifeline. We had people in Minnesota and Indiana and friends from out of town. Of course, that's not true. New Orleans is the kind of place where people live for generations. And there were people that not only lost everything, but all their people lost everything. I met one old lady in a shelter in Lafayette. She said, everyone I know is in the same boat. I don't know where to get a different boat. They had nowhere to turn from it and still don't. So I had a hard time trying to get into this place. It's called the Cajun Dome in Lafayette. There were thousands of New Orleanians there. New Orleans is a small enough town that I knew that I would know people in there, or I would know people who knew people that were in there. And I wanted to hear their stories. Well, at that point, the Red Cross was staffing it. There were Red Cross volunteers. And this is a good reminder for everybody to turn off their cell phones. That's actually my daughter. I don't know why she's calling me, but anyway, she knows it. Yeah. There was this, I'm going to wait for that call to go away here. Did you notice the song when the Saints Go Marching In? That's the sign. If you ever hear that in your store and you hear when the Saints Go Marching In on the cell phone, it's a really good chance that somebody had ended up here after Katrina from New Orleans. Not always, but I've actually heard that and gone and asked, and they said, oh yeah, Another sign is that you can keep your 504 area code from New Orleans. There's a little club of people who left New Orleans, and they're called the 504-evers. And there we go, and it goes off. There's a picture of my kids, if you all saw it. So I was in the Cajun Dome in Lafayette, and I wanted to get in the Cajun Dome, and there was no way in. The Red Cross volunteers worked in media as well, and they were nice and well-meaning, but they just weren't really cooperative as far as getting in, and there were privacy issues, I guess. But I knew, as a New Orleanian, there were people there that wanted to meet other New Orleanians and tell their story, and so that didn't work. Working as a journalist didn't work. There were no press passes at that point I could get. I tried to go in as a volunteer. My mom, who's a therapist, actually came down to visit and tried to go in as a volunteer, and she was told this was the week after Katrina that we don't need any therapists in there. So I had friends that wanted to go in and just help serve food. A friend of mine and her daughter went to volunteer, and they were told, you're from New Orleans, you should be off resting. Well, nobody wanted to rest at that point. So finally I realized, well, I've got a New Orleans driver's license. I just checked in. I said, need a cot. Went in and got a cot and spent that evening talking to people and finding out their stories. And what I found, the story that I found out that captivated me is that people said, yeah, there was school in here. I said, there's school in here. Yeah, there was a school right in the middle of the Cajun Dome as the evacuations were going on, that people set up a school in the center. So I wanted to find out about this because I was writing about schools and writing about kids. So I called the Lafayette Parish, and it took weeks and weeks and weeks. And finally, I found out, yeah, there's some teachers that led classes in the Cajun Dome during the midst of the evacuation. As everyone was sleeping in cots, families were forming their little cot locations for themselves. I mean, it was very incredibly touching to see families forming a little household, in different sections of the Cajun Dome with everything they owned at that time. I got the names of the teachers and wanted to go meet them, and I walked into the place where the teachers were waiting for me, and one of them was my daughter's kindergarten teacher, unbeknownst to me, Miss Ann. And they were now on a new journey. They were now on a new job. They had basically worked in the Cajun Dome. They had, there was a Hurricane Rita, which is lesser known, but it was the second hurricane that hit Louisiana, especially hit coastal Louisiana. During the evacuation in the Cajun Dome in Lafayette for Hurricane Rita, All these people have been evacuated to this center. We're now being evacuated out of there to go up to Shreveport. You can imagine these teachers now, and these were 3 public school teachers. They were not trained in disaster teaching or anything like that. They were passing out books to kids to encourage the older kids to read to the younger kids on the bus. They were continuing to teach math and English while the parents were running around gathering their things to leave, because they were asked to keep on to the kids for a while so the parents could get things going again. Well, now these teachers were going around in Lafayette and the surrounding towns to evaluate all the kids from Katrina and Rita to see how they were doing. So I asked if I could come along for a day of this evaluation, and they agreed to let me come along, provided I didn't respect the privacy of the kids, not say any kids' names, that kind of thing, which I did. And this is what I found out. I'm going to read to you a brief passage here. This is from my trip to a town called Scott, Louisiana. After this, I'm just going to open this up for discussion, and we could talk about any questions you have about the book, about kids, about Katrina, about New Orleans now. But this is what happened in Scott, Louisiana in the fall of 2005. Like most school buildings in the Lafayette area, West Side is a sprawling, one-story structure sitting on neatly kept grounds with an attached playground. Walking inside, one of the first things I noticed was an art project displayed in one of the corridors. Students drew timelines of their lives, decorated with their own baby pictures, with photos of their parents, vacation photos, school pictures of friends. But a few of the timelines on the wall were illustrated only with computer-generated line drawings of birthday cakes or faces or animals. These were the children who owned no photographs. These were the evacuees. The school's principal, Carol Broussard, greeted the New Orleans teachers. Keith Bartlett, the leader of the 3, explained how the team liked to work. 3 children would come into the room at a time. Ann Crow would be seated at one table to test reading skills. Janie Malvo would sit at another table to check on math. And Linda Eubanks would talk with the children to see if they needed more counseling. Keith carried a folder that contained freshly minted informal student assessment sheets. That sounds official, but they had actually printed that up the day before, came up with a name for it. They were going day by day like all of us were. Informal assessment sheets on which the teachers could mark down how well the students were doing in language and math. There was a line in the evaluation called storm information. In addition to New Orleans students, a few evacuees from Hurricane Rita also were at the school. Boxes could be checked to indicate Katrina or Rita, and other boxes were used to mark who evacuated pre-storm and those who stayed during the flood. The teachers coded all their notes by using different colored markers. An orange marker was for children who suffered trauma related to one of the hurricanes. Orange came out when a child talked about seeing another child fall out of a boat, and the adults just couldn't flip him over fast enough. Or when they learned about a boy who didn't stop asking everyone who was going to visit New Orleans to look for a cat with spots. He had to leave that cat behind. Please, he would ask, keep an eye out for a cat with spots. The rotations began, 3 children each cycle. The first group to arrive were 3 girls, each wearing a heavy jacket over her school uniform. Ladies, I'm here with my friends, and all of us were chased out of New Orleans by this storm named Katrina, Keith said in the same soft, explanatory tones he'd used with the principal. He told the girls the school district hired the teachers to check on the kids to see if they needed any kind of help. You're not in any trouble, he assured them. Behind Keith, in a room decorated with posters advertising good judgment and teamwork, the 3 teachers sat at evenly spaced tables. At Linda Eubanks' table, a rocking chair was available for a child to sit in. At the far end of the room, Cynthia Bernard, the school counselor, sat at her desk and caught up on paperwork. Over the next couple of hours, as students rotated through the room, I listened to the murmur of conversations, a mix of questions about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, or how to round off numbers, or about floods. "We're not going back," said one girl with her ponytail pulled back into a white ribbon as Janie nodded. I heard Anne ask another girl, "Are you able to concentrate in school?" The girl said it was kind of hard. "Because you're thinking about other things?" Anne asked. The girl said yes. "We had to leave our cat," she said. "I don't know if he's okay." 3 by 3, they came in again and again. I heard Janie repeat her own story to the children at the table. She seemed to know each neighborhood and each street the children listed. She told them about her own house, how it had flooded. The children answered her story with a story of their own. "My name is Miss Linda, and I'm going to talk with you about the storm or whatever brought you here," Linda said to a boy who was melting into his rocking chair. "We stayed at a truck stop," the boy said. "I slept there. We left with my iguana named Herbie. When my bird and fish died, I should have saved them." Do you like the Transformers?" a boy asked Anne. She looked at him carefully and paused. "Medium," she said. I'm not crazy about them." "Well, I go to Planet Drool," he said. "For make-believe fun?" she asked. He said, "No, for real fun." Anne made marks on the form as the boy talked excitedly about Shark Boy and Lava Girl and Mr. Electric and how together they fight the hurricane. And after the storm, he evacuated to Planet Drool. And after Planet Drool, he went to his mama's house. When the boy was done at Anne's table, he started drawing superheroes. Keith told him it was time for his recess, and the boy waved him off. "I'd rather draw," he said. "When I was a little girl, that's just where I grew up," I heard Janie telling a girl. "Now, which of these numbers is 450 when rounded to the nearest 10 and 500 when rounded to the nearest 100? I'll give you a few minutes." They kept coming, from Chalmette, or the Ninth Ward, or the West Bank, each carrying a portion of the hurricane and the grief. After a while, I dropped to the back of the classroom. Cynthia Bernard had been a counselor at the school for the past 10 years and a teacher before that. She said local parents were concerned at first about this influx of new children. She told them, "Put yourself in that shoe." Then they all went to work, helping each kid get school uniforms of red, white, and blue shirts and navy and khaki pants. And a school in Minnesota donated the coats. She spoke softly as a new group of girls entered the room. "These are some of our children who came right after the storm." She said they've been in a KOA campground in Scott. Cynthia told me how one girl said her cousin had slipped off the roof. The water kept rising. The cousin couldn't be reached. She kept going back to, "I lost a cousin. How could I lose a cousin?" And she said they have to go back now to identify her body. I asked her how she gets children to talk about such things. She pulled out a folder. It was marked New Orleans. "They express how they feel in art," she said. "Then when they talk, they're just talking about a picture. It gives them a pass." She opened the folder, which was filled with drawings. The first one was a simple picture of a house, a square topped by a triangle. But the triangle was tilted off the square, and a dark horizontal line was scrawled through the center of the picture. In another, a road grew smaller until it ended abruptly at a wall of dark gray clouds. I asked if the children talked about dreams. I told Cynthia my 4-year-old had woken up the previous night with a dream that he'd been left behind. He said he dreamed the family had gone to a movie without him. Cynthia nodded. "The thing I noticed the most is that none of them went to sleep alone," she said. We paged through more drawings, some of which displayed children's faces with frowns and large teardrops. The children had been asked to write feeling words next to the drawings, and you saw the same words over and over. Page after page, sad, sorry, angry, hurt, mad, guilty. "You see this girl here?" Cynthia said, looking up as a tiny girl sat down in the rocking chair to talk with Linda. Then she showed me a drawing by the same girl, a self-portrait of a girl standing in front of a house with tears falling from her face in diagonal lines. "What do you notice here?" I asked. "How big the house is," she said. "It's a big feeling." Those kids are still there. They're still hurting, I can tell you. There are groups. If you go to, I forgot the website, but if you go to children's, if you Google, you can all Google, right? If you Google the New Orleans Museum of Art, it will bring you to Katrina's Children exhibit they have of art done by Katrina kids. The Children's Bureau in New Orleans and other groups are working using art therapy to help the kids put down on paper what's in their heads and talk about it. I can tell you now, however, that the people who are in charge of those organizations are very concerned because there was a big influx of donations, an amazing influx of donations and help the year after Katrina, the second year after Katrina. It went to a lot of crisis counseling, a lot of short-term necessary counseling, a lot of the kind of work you saw being done by these teachers here to evaluate kids and see where they were. But what's needed now is long-term counseling help for these kids to get to the next step and for their families to get to the next step where they need to go. It's going to take a group effort. I see Katrina as a great American tragedy. It's also, of course, as you all know, a great American opportunity. New Orleans is our city as much as any other city, and it's all up to us. I meant to say this last night, but I can be reached if anybody's interested in finding out more about New Orleans, efforts to volunteer, anything like that. I have a website. Right now it's really just sort of a Contact Michael page, but www.michaeltisserand.com. Laura, if you grab her in the hall, she can contact me too. But feel free if anybody needs to contact me for more information about anything. I'm certainly available for that. I would like to raise this now to something we couldn't do last night, which is have some questions and answer and discussion. I know people here have their own experiences. I know a number of people went down from Salisbury to New Orleans. Every time I talk, there's always somebody that's a native of New Orleans. It always teaches me something. Or if any questions about New Orleans or anything else, open it up. While I get a cup of coffee. Yeah. Yeah, the question was about depression and PTSD after Katrina. Yeah, they did a study, LSU did a study of 2,700 kids that came back to New Orleans after Katrina. The majority of them fit the criteria needed for mental health assistance. It used to believe that kids didn't experience PTSD. That was just sort of seen as something that grown-ups that went to war or something experienced. My first trip to a FEMA trailer camp in September of 2005, I saw certainly the kids were experiencing post-traumatic stress syndrome. The kids were shoving everything under their under their what do you call it in a trailer? Not a cot, but the bunks. They were shoving everything under their bunks, everything they owned at that point. There were a lot of fights. Keith, the guy that I talked about, who had the bridge team, is now principal of a district elementary school in New Orleans. And he's worked in alternative schools all of his life. He taught in the school that when kids got kicked out of other schools, that's the school they went to in New Orleans. So he's not sort of unaccustomed to these kinds of experiences. And he said he's never seen anything like what he's seen with the elementary school kids and their rage. And he attributes not only to Katrina and the experience of going through the flood, of losing people in those traumatic situations, but of all the changes that the kids have had to go through in the 2 years after Katrina. And the studies done on kids with PTSD, there was a major study done by a Florida team, the kids following Hurricane Andrew. And what they learned is that it's not just the original event, but it's the aftershocks, it's the divorces, it's the upheaval in the family, it's the more fights, going on, between parents, and that the school is changing, not being able to get back with your friends again. All those trigger the PTSD for kids. So it's sort of like the aftershocks that go on for kids. So in that sense, it's very literal to say that Katrina is still going on and for some kids still just beginning, because each one of those events is considered a new event, for kids. Anything else? Yeah. Question is percentage of kids who return to New Orleans after Katrina. I don't know the number, and the number is really hard to come by. The the understanding by looking at various data is that right now, I would say about 3/5 of New Orleans is back in New Orleans. Some people say half, some people say 2/3. I would say about 3/5, which is really, I mean, it means that there are some parts of New Orleans that look like a ghost town still. But it's also incredibly remarkable to think that 3/5 of the population would go back to the city when, if you have certain medical conditions, you just can't go back to New Orleans because the hospitals are still devastated and they won't, care for you. And there's a great uncertainty still in New Orleans. The levees are still not built up to where they need to be. They may be restored back to the level where they failed, during Katrina, which was not a massive storm the way it hit Mississippi. By the time it hit New Orleans, it was a fast-moving Category 2 storm. So about 3/5 of the population. As far as the kids, I would say about the same, or maybe a little less, because a lot of the people that are moving to New Orleans now, there's an influx, and it's a very welcome influx, of young people without kids that are interested in being part of the rebuilding of New Orleans. So schools are still very much in disarray in New Orleans, so a lot of people with kids are opting to stay where they are. Another thing that's happening in New Orleans is, and this has been a widespread phenomenon, the New York Times reported about it, is that some kids are moving back without their parents. That parents are staying in Houston or Atlanta, and kids, especially 15, 16-year-old kids, are coming back to town, staying with friends because they want to get back to school and get back to their friends, which is a great concern, that kids are coming back and the families are being, further disrupted this way. Certainly I know from my experience in New Orleans that people who lived in poverty in the city relied on extended family networks. And it was, if auntie was there or if the grandmother was there, that made a big difference if you couldn't afford childcare, if you're working 2 jobs. And that's another disruption in the city right now, that even if a family made it back, if a piece of that family is not there the way it was before, it doesn't fit together the same way for people, especially right now. One of the great problems in New Orleans is a complete lack of daycare. There just isn't childcare right now. I know this from friends of mine that have, there with young kids and limited income, and there's really it's really bereft of opportunities right now. Probably one of the greatest needs for young families right now is childcare in New Orleans. Yeah. Wow, what a good question. One I've never been asked before. The question was, what role did music play in the lives of kids? I'm not sure I can separate the kids and the adults in this situation. It was exquisitely painful to hear New Orleans songs the first few days after Katrina. It was very painful to hear songs like Randy Newman's Louisiana 1927, to hear songs like, one could not listen to Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans at that point in time, because it brought back the flood of memories of hearing these songs in happier times. New Orleans kids have their own relationship to music that is unique and only really makes sense in New Orleans. There are songs that New Orleans kids know that are as common to New Orleans kids as Jingle Bells is to another kid. Songs like Mardi Gras Mambo. Down in New Orleans where the blues, I won't sing it for you. Down in New Orleans where the blues is born, it takes a cool cat to blow a horn. On LaSalle and Rampart Street, the cats go jiving to a mambo beat. Mardi Gras Mambo. Every Mardi Gras parade plays that. And no matter what you've seen on CNN or what you've heard about Mardi Gras, New Orleanians know Mardi Gras as a family holiday, a family event. There are parades that go through the neighborhoods for weeks leading up. You go to a friend's house, you have a picnic there or something, and you all go to the parade together. So it's very much a family event. The kids in the schools, a big New Orleans craft is making shoebox floats, shoebox parades, and then walking around school with your shoebox parade and singing these songs. There's a guy named Papillon that I talked about in Sugarcane Academy. He's a New Orleans musician, plays a lot of Cajun music, and he was going around. My wife actually knew him. He's a great guy. And he before Katrina, he would go on his own dime and on his own time to the hospitals in New Orleans and play for kids that were, cancer or whatever, and just, do little concerts. That's something he did. He didn't have a grant to do that. He just did that. And my wife would always come home, she's a pediatrician, and say, I saw Pappy on again, and he was just sitting in this room playing guitar. So he was okay. His house didn't flood. He had all his stuff. So he was going around doing that basic same thing, going to little, shelters and places that he could get in. He also could not get into the Cajun Dome, like my mom, went to the Cajun Dome and said, I'd like to come and volunteer. And he was told, well, we got everything we need here, which was ridiculous. But he would go to smaller shelters and play for kids. And I got a hold of him. I knew him. And he came out to Sugarcane Academy. And he brought his guitar. And he played When the Saints Go Marching In and Mardi Gras Mambo and all these songs. And for the kids, it was a reminder of who they were. More than, in a way that only music, the same way that only art can draw certain things out, only music. You can't say, well, if it wasn't for that song, they would have gotten it some other way. It was a musical reminder of who they were, and it was absolutely distinct and absolutely necessary. And he told me that I think I mentioned this in the book, I think he told me that the first time he went to a shelter, he was playing music for kids and wasn't sure if he should play a song like Mardi Gras Mambo or The Saints or something like that. And it was a pastor who was also evacuated there, talked to him and said, the kids need to hear this, play the song. And so that's what he'd been doing. So, yeah, music. It also made, the first time I went out to hear music after the hurricane, there was a benefit. And at first I just didn't want to go to, it was a Zydeco benefit for Katrina victims. And some people I knew were playing. And I didn't really want to go because the last thing I wanted to do was to go hear music and dance at that point. But I went because of the benefit. I went, and the experience of hearing music that dated back, in this case, the 1920s and earlier, reminded me of that the kind of music that I know and love in Louisiana has survived through all kinds of tragedies, and it's helped people get through. And there's something to kind of hold on there. There's a line in a Bob Dylan song, "Strap yourself to a tree with roots," and that sort of came to mind. That this music is really rooted, and for those of us who may not be so rooted, I didn't grow up with it necessarily. You can kind of cling on to it. It really helps. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I mentioned this word Zydeco, and I think some of you all are in music class, right? Right? Yeah. Oh, this side. This is the music side over here, and this is. Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Well, who here has heard Zydeco music? Just one? Okay. Who here has heard? Okay, wait. Okay, who here has ever heard Paul Simon's Graceland album? Okay, so you've all heard Zydeco music because there's a Zydeco song on that album, and there's more. If I play Zydeco music, you will recognize it. It's played with accordion and rubboard. It is a very festive, happy-sounding music, the dance music, but the lyrics, which are in French and Creole and English, are very plaintive, and in fact, they're about poverty. The music, like much music from New Orleans, is very soulful, and it's about getting through hard times. The word Zydeco is associated with the phrase "Les haricots sont pas salés," which means the snap beans are not salty, which sounds like nonsense. What's that? But actually what it means is that snap beans were salted with pieces of meat, with salt meat. That's how the flavor got into cooking. By saying the snap beans are not salty, it's saying we don't have any meat in the house. So it's an expression of poverty. And like the blues, there's like a sense of when you get together, you are through the Zydeco, because Zydeco is not only a type of music, it also refers to the type of dance and it refers to the event. So you'd say, let's go Zydeco to the Zydeco music at the Zydeco. And that music in southwest and rural Louisiana is a way to people to come along, to come together, understand their common ailments, and then dance for the whole night anyway. And in doing so, sort of transform the community into a community of celebration. Very much how social music works around the world. And in New Orleans, it's the same thing, that these songs, because they are rooted in the place, have a sense of belonging, a sense of geography, and a sense of community in a way that is not unique to New Orleans, but is very special to the city and very special to people that are from there. So, Buckwheat Zydeco is a guy that comes to Washington, D.C. and Baltimore a lot. There are a lot of touring acts that come. You'll see him on TV. And there are a lot of other Zydeco bands that never leave Louisiana and just play for dances and, in dance halls around there. And when you go to New Orleans, and I didn't say if, but when you all go to New Orleans, on Thursday night there's a bowling alley that always has Zydeco. It's called Rock and Bowl, and I encourage you all to go to Rock and Bowl very, very heartily. There's another question over here. Do we got to get going?
No.
Oh. Oh, here. And here. That's okay. I can hold both. I can. No, you can't take my coffee. This is a painting done by an artist in Lafayette. This is the rub board down here by my fingers. That is the percussion instrument, the main percussion instrument in Zydeco. This is a picture of the accordion. And the back here, which you can't really see, but you can come up and take a look. You don't have to buy it. You can come up and take a look at it if you want. This is a picture from a Zydeco dance from the 1970s showing Clifton Chenier, who is referred to as the king of Zydeco. The first person to come up with that term was Clifton Chenier himself. He was sort of influenced by James Brown, who would come out in the cape and the garb of royalty, and he decided he was going to do that with Zydeco, and showed up one night with a crown sort of like this, kind of like a margarine crown, the imperial margarine crown, a big poofy crown, and he wore it every time when he played. And the amazing thing was, he was such a performer and such command of his audience that no one ever laughed. No one ever questioned that. No one ever said, what's that guy doing with that crazy crown on his head? That's just the kind of person he was. We'll talk more about him later on in the class. Yes?
I know that the arts and music is such an integral part, it's a huge part of the world. What efforts, I know you mentioned last night about museum art.
Mm-hmm.
What efforts would you need to bring arts and music back into the
Yeah. That's been a primary focus for a lot of groups. The question was about what efforts, given the importance of arts and music in New Orleans, what efforts are being done to bring this back to New Orleans or keep us in New Orleans. A lot of efforts, both large and small. There's a friend of mine who's a tuba player in Minneapolis with a band called Mama Digdown's Brass Band. It's a New Orleans-influenced brass band. And they sort of adopted a New Orleans brass band called the Hot 8 Brass Band, who's had a musician killed, actually. Daenerys Shavers had a drummer killed on the streets about a year ago and was facing a lot of difficulties after Katrina, that being one of them. And they sort of adopted this band, and he drove down, all the musicians lost their instruments in Katrina, drove down from Minnesota with a pickup truck full of instruments and donations for this band and for other bands. That's being done on a much larger scale. There's a group called Tipitina's Foundation. There's a club in New Orleans called Tipitina's, another place I recommend you go to. I guess you have to be a certain age to get there, but it's Louisiana. You'll be able to walk in. Tipitina's has turned from a music club to a nonprofit foundation to help bring music back to New Orleans on a very large scale. They're helping get instruments back into the hands of New Orleans musicians. That includes getting band instruments into the schools. School bands are like everywhere, but school bands are a really important part of New Orleans music. The bands play at Mardi Gras parades. The brass bands come out of the school bands. So that's being done with the music across the board, and a number of musicians lost everything. Lost all their instruments. Music Cares is an organization now, the Grammy Foundation, that also has been working. A lot of people, Bono has been a big part of this. A lot of very well-known musicians have donated a lot of time. The Edge actually has been an even larger part of it. He's been, New Orleans is kind of strange. You kind of walk down the street, and oh, there's the Edge. Oh, there's Brad Pitt. You know, there are a lot of people who come from seats of power and wealth that really have used that as a conduit to help people in New Orleans. Brad Pitt is establishing houses in the lower Ninth Ward, green housing. He's 180 houses right now. He's helped to build, and the Edge has helped do an incredible amount to bring instruments back for New Orleanians. As is the case, one of the great shortages now is teachers. That the instruments can come back, but of course, you know, to get the teachers there, and it's a matter of not necessarily bringing teachers in. There are people there that can teach. It's a matter of funding positions, so the people there, you know, if schools are struggling, as we all know too well, music and art are a couple of the first things to get cut back or scaled back. So, you know, trying to keep those positions in the schools is a really big part of the effort. If you want more information about those groups, Tipitina's Foundation, it's got a big website. WWOZ is a community radio station in New Orleans, and that has links on its website, WWOZ, to all kinds of efforts to help musicians in New Orleans. The same thing's going on with the visual arts. When I went to Houston to talk at that school, I went along with three art teachers. They were part of a group whose name escapes me right now, but it's in the book. Kids Smart, that's a group, Kids Smart, and it's big ART at the end. And that's working to help keep art and bring art into the public schools in New Orleans. So that's going on as well. And a lot of efforts like that are going on. There's a lot of need. It's not all being met at this point, but the efforts are going on. Do you have time for any more? Yeah.
Why did you write the Kingdom of Zydeco? Was it based on a personal experience like Sugarcane Family?
No. I'll answer that question in reverse. Sugarcane Academy was a departure for me. I've never written personally before. You know, I sat down. I didn't think I was going to write. I didn't know I was going to write about Katrina until I got a call from a friend of mine that it works with the alternative weekly papers like the Washington City paper, Baltimore. That's part of an association, and he said, "You want to write something?" This was the day after the levees broke, and I just sat down and kind of poured something out of my heart, and made it very personal. I wrote about my friend Katie, who is I think is one of the greatest writers in New Orleans. She just got a staff job at the Times-Picayune. I'm so happy she made it back to New Orleans. But at that point, the last I heard is she was in a hospital giving birth to her first child, and I didn't know where she was. I didn't know how she was doing. So that's what I wrote about. I said, I don't know where these people are. I had my own reasons for doing that. I figured if enough papers published this article, I'd find out where Katie was, and I did. I got an email and found out. But before that, I'd never really written in first person before. I'd never really written in that style. I could not be more different from the people I was writing about in the Kingdom of Zydeco. These are French-speaking African-American Creoles that live in small towns in Louisiana. I'm an English-speaking guy that was raised in Minnesota and Indiana. But when I first got to New Orleans, I heard a Zydeco band, and it grabbed me. And the music, you know, I walked in this place called Maple Leaf Bar. They still have Zydeco music there. It could be a set from a Tennessee Williams play. It's got pressed tin walls and ceiling fans. And there's this band playing in French, and there's all these couples, you know, dancing as couples. And I never, you know, had that experience of, you know, hi, do you want to dance? And you know the steps, and you twirl and all that kind of thing. It looked like something from the 19th century to me, and I wanted to learn how to dance. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized there were stories behind these songs. And that indeed there is a culture, and there is meaning to these songs that are not immediately evident to someone listening. Even if you can translate the French, you don't really know what Zydeco se passe means. And then beyond that, there's stories that you don't know about the music and about musicians that musicians tell each other. And I realized there's a whole culture behind this music. And for me, what was even equally as important is nobody had written about it at that time. There were a lot of writers I admire. Peter Gralnick, who did a volume biography of Elvis and did a great biography of Sam Cooke. And I'd written about a lot of musical subcultures and was sort of my role model in writing this book. Just had not done anything in Louisiana at that point. So there was that possibility to do that. So I was able to convince the publisher that somebody would actually buy a book about Zydeco music, and spend a year down in Lafayette really doing nothing except going and talking to the musicians who were well known. Buckwheat Zydeco has played on David Letterman's show and, gone around the country. But then asking them, who are the musicians around here nobody's ever heard of, and driving out and meeting these folks. And then those were even the more exciting trips, to find some old guy that, had stories to tell about how, Clifton Chenier, the king of Zydeco, once walked up to him and said, "I can play better than you." And he said, "I can play better than you." And at the end of the day, he played and Clifton said, "Don't tell anybody, you're the king." I don't know if any of these stories are true or not. But even if they're not literally true, they tell a very true story about what Zydeco music means to the culture, that someone who can master an accordion has status in the community in a way that the richest man in the community maybe doesn't. So it was all these stories sort of told me something about that culture. And thank heavens I had a woman named Carolyn Riall, who was actually Buckwheat Zydeco's cousin, who agreed to come with me to talk to the older folks, because they didn't speak English and I didn't speak French, so she was my translator. So no, it was, I had a personal connection to music in that I loved it. And if you're going to be a writer and you're not writing, and if you don't have a connection, if you don't have an understanding or a love of what you're writing about, you're kind of starting 3 steps behind. But my goal is to take that love and turn it into a more objective portrait of a culture that, the word "I" is in Sugarcane Academy a lot, but the word "I" is not in King of Zydeco at all. Thank you all for the questions. It was great. Thank you for the discussion.
Thank you. I think we're okay.
Okay.
Our time is about up, but thank you, Michael, very much for being here
Thank
with
you.
us. I didn't mention at the very beginning, but the books that we have for sale, if you're interested in purchasing them, are 20% off. So if you are interested, we've got some over here, and I know several of you purchased books last night and wanted to get them signed this morning, so we'll take a few minutes to do that before we wrap up. But thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura.